Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to open this panel on blue carbon. Of course, before I do that, however, I would like to introduce, it is indeed my honor to be able to introduce the legendary Sylvia Earle. She, of course, needs no introduction, but is someone who deserves at least a very brief introduction. She asked me backstage to keep it brief, since we are running a little bit late. But I did want to highlight a few things that, of course, you may or may not know about her. She was the first woman chief scientist of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. She is an explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society. And she recently founded an organization called Mission Blue, which brings people together and organizations to create a network of marine protected areas around the world and to provide hope in the future, for the future of our oceans. And also something that she has always been passionate about, to develop and implement new technologies to explore the oceans. As I'm sure that she will explain to you, we have only ever explored very little of our oceans, less than 10%, and most of that is in the coastal regions. She's been a strong advocate during her entire career on deep ocean exploration and has logged over 6,000 hours underwater. That is truly a staggering amount of time exploring the oceans. And on a personal note, she's been a friend of mine for many years and someone that I look up to as a visionary, as a leader, and as inspiration for all of us to understand the critical importance of protecting our water planet. So with that, I will invite Dr. Sylvia Earle. Sylvia, and I'm going to call each of the speakers of our further panelists up one by one and give a brief introduction of them. We're going to start with Dr. Peter Prokosch, who is a marine biologist and a PhD on Arctic shorebirds. He spent 23 years with the World Wildlife Fund, studying in the Weddell Sea as the Arctic coordinator, and then as CEO of World Wildlife Fund Germany. And he's the managing director of the UNEP Grid Arundel program, UNEP's Polar Marine Communication Center, and also a co-author of the book Blue Carbon in the Arabian Peninsula. Then I would like to invite, make sure I get the order right here, Carl Gustav Lunden. He's the director of the Global Marine and Polar Program at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN. His primary responsibility is to develop the program in 4 areas: marine protected areas, building partnerships for conservation of ecosystems and endangered marine species, sustainable fisheries management, and climate change effects on marine resources. He's responsible for all aspects of managing the program, as well as fundraising and development of public information materials. And before joining IUCN, he worked with the World Bank in over 100 countries on coastal and marine management issues. Next up, I would like to invite Beatrix Schmulling. She is the Energy Efficiency Clean Development Mechanism implementation team leader of Masdar here in Abu Dhabi. She's been here for 4 years and has been working for prior to that on environmental situations in developing countries with a specific interest in politics around climate change, carbon reduction solutions, focusing on cities and industries, energy efficiency and renewable energy projects. And also, and this was in her bio, I'm sure you'll all appreciate knowing, she has a passion for flamenco dancing. So, then next, I would like to invite Rolf Payet. Dr. Rolf Payet, he's the president of the University of the Seychelles and a special advisor to the president of the Seychelles. And as an international policy expert and researcher on environmental and island issues, Rolf is currently special advisor, as I said, to the president on numerous environmental matters, including sustainable development, biodiversity, climate change, energy, and international environmental policy. He's also the founding member and trustee of the Global Island Partnership, the Sea Level Rise Foundation, the Seychelles University Foundation, the Seychelles Center for Marine Research and Technology, the Island Conservation Society, and the Silhouette Foundation. Wow, okay, jeez. Amazing, very impressive. And then our last panelist is a Dr. Thabit Zarain. He is the head of biodiversity at the and the director, of biodiversity management sector here at the Emirates, United Arab Emirates. He worked before as the director of Marine Science Center in Oman. He sits on UNESCO's Biosphere Reserve Advisory Committee. He's the member of the Global Oceans Coastal and Island Steering Committee, and he was the science sponsor of the Indian Ocean Carbon Flux Studies. He's authored a number of books and scientific articles on marine biodiversity in the region. So a distinguished panel that we are delighted to have join us this morning. Now, I'm going to remind all our panelists that we've got about 45 minutes, so I'd like to keep it brief and keep our answers brief as possible so that we can all get into a dialogue and discussion. This isn't just going to be a Q&A. I do want y'all to feel free to engage and make comments on each other's answers. I am going to get things going with the first question for Rolf, actually. I'm interested, coming from an island community, certainly I think you're perhaps best able to give us a little bit of context of why blue carbon and these ecosystems are so important and why we should care about them.
You know, a lot of people who live on large masses of land, really when they wake up in the morning and when they go about doing their life chores and roads, going on highways and everything, they really don't understand the interlinkages between us as humans and what happens in the oceans. When you live on an island, you hear about what the fisherman is saying, whether there's a collapse in the fisheries, you hear about the birds, you hear about the environment. So people on islands are very much connected to what's happening. And we see the early signs of the stress. We see the early signs of climate change, we see the early signs of overfishing, and as a result, we have become very concerned. And that is why many of us, and you have the Prime Minister of Cook Islands who's going to be here and talking about the impact of those impacts on the marine environment, on the livelihoods of the islands. And obviously, following from what Sylvia said this morning, the whole world is connected. And this is what we are here about. So blue carbon is an opportunity, I think. It's an opportunity for us to first take into account what we as humans are doing to our marine environment. It's an opportunity for us to be able to value those resources and in turn use this as a platform for solutions to the current problems that we have. So this is where I see blue carbon helping from the island perspective.
Now, I'm curious with your work and time in the Seychelles and in the islands, what is in your opinion, the greatest impact that the island nations in the Pacific are facing?
Well, the greatest impact is, of course, two-sided. First, we have the impact on the fisheries, where you have a lot of large nations, a lot of the fishing industry coming in and putting a lot of pressure on the fisheries. Then you have the local impact, where fisheries is a food security issue, where people consume huge amounts of food. And so you have these two dimensions to look at in the context of the marine environment, in the context of fisheries, for example.
Now, you mentioned climate change. That is, of course, rising sea levels, a big issue. Many island nations are facing the very real prospect in the next few decades, as President Clinton alluded to yesterday morning, of literally disappearing. And I'm curious, Carl, is blue carbon really a viable option for climate change mitigation? And can you tell us a little bit about the science behind that?
Yes, I think we have a wonderful opportunity here to actually work with restoring nature and to take the full potential of what nature has offered us. Many of us have, I think, started to looking at the terrestrial systems, particularly how can we build the soil layer, what can we do to replant forest and restore them. But few of us have actually started thinking of what can we do in the marine environment. And I think the story is a very positive one. There are good opportunities for us. We're just getting started, I think, in the accounting process of trying to understand, the science behind it, and then from there on, I think it's a matter of trying to find also the policy options. How can we motivate people to do it? How can we actually have virtuous cycles, virtuous policies that permit us to do a good job here? If we look at the different options, it turns out that some of the coastal ecosystems are 50 or even up to 75 times more efficient than the same type of area on land in terms of sequestering carbon. Now, that's a wonderful opportunity for us, but it's one that we're squandering right now. we're doing a lot of silly things in the ocean. We're doing land reclamation projects. We're doing very destructive things to the marine environment. And if we stop this and actually start restoring instead, I think we will at least help our carbon footprint.
Now, a few two interesting statistics that I read in a recent report. The average saltwater marsh contains about 1,300 tons of CO2 per hectare. And mangroves contain about 1,900 tons of CO2 per hectare. Those are considerable numbers. What is the type of science that's really going on right now with respect to continuing to put evaluation? Because of course, you know, and any of you, you know, add comment on this as well. One of the hindrances to adopting the concept of ecosystem services and understanding ecosystem services is really how do you balance accounts? How do you really begin to value and attach an economic value to those systems? Not only how do you understand them, but really what is the economic system for valuing them?
First you have to have the data, and there's a big gap right now with the basic data. You can't put a figure on it until you know what you've got. But that's no excuse for ignoring it, and we have been ignoring it. So we just have to rapidly scale up.
So in a sense, blue carbon is an addition to understanding, or an expansion of the ecosystem-based services that coastal ecosystems provide, salt marsh, mangroves, seagrass beds, et cetera.
And a blue ocean beyond.
Yeah, of course,
And a deep ocean.
huge carbon sink.
But what I think is already very encouraging is that after 3 years, the term blue carbon has been set in the world, and we produced this rapid assessment report for IUCN and UNEP. We actually colored the carbons in blue, green, brown, and black. After 3 years, the blue carbon message is so far out in the world, and that I think is the first very encouraging signal. So the fact that the world understood, as we with our various networks relating to research institutions have brought this message out, that about 70% of the entire global ocean's capacity to store carbon is in these habitats, which cover only less than 0.5% of the global ocean seabed. So you have a very concise figure where you have to focus. And that comes only in addition to the many different values which mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrasses have. As many of us are working in these fields and gathering here also at this important summit, know that mangroves, for instance, have a major significance for a whole set of biodiversity, for fishery, their nursery grounds, as all these areas where this blue carbon exists are mostly very shallow areas, highly productive areas, and depends on estuaries, on certain freshwater input as well, on an irregular coast. And it is just the picture that we have to make sure that we are not straightening the coast, that we are not reclaiming. And I have actually a very encouraging example for myself. I'm working in the Waddenzee. The Waddenzee, which belongs to the Netherlands and Germany and Denmark, in previous centuries has always been seen as a value as being a potential agriculture field. It has been embanked step by step. Half of Holland has been produced by that. But nowadays, and only by a shift of opinion about the value, since the late 70s, this process has stopped and the value is seen, and there you have major salt marshes and seagrasses in the biodiversity value. It's the largest, or one of the largest marine protectors in the world. It's an international park, and the local people have been behind of supporting that. It became recently a World Heritage Site. That's all, and massive tourism is there. You can actually see millions of tourists in harmony with nature, and that produced another value. And I think that can be a good example also for this region, where we may talk about later on.
Well, I think that's a great example, and brings me to my next question. That I wanted to open it up. I wanted to hear from each of you. If you could, starting with Abid, if you could share with us one example of a successful program that is in existence now, or you hope will be implemented in the near future. As President Clinton explained this yesterday morning, I think very eloquently, it's so important to have quantifiable, successful demonstration projects to be able to show the efficacy of these types of programs. And so I just wanted to, each of you, give you an opportunity to share some good news or an inspiring or successful project. So often these types of panels and this information is doom and gloom and negative, so I'd like to hear something positive from each of you as we walk down.
The thing that comes to mind is our program on mangrove plantation. In fact, the United Arab Emirates, and particularly Abu Dhabi, is among the few, if it's not the only place, where over the last 10 years, the mangrove area has increased. Last year, we have planted about more than 2 million mangroves
Wow.
between ourselves and our stakeholders. And if you look at the size of a country, that is quite a substantial figure. And we are doing that in an ecologically balanced way because we are cognizant of the need to protect other resources like the salt marshes, like nesting grounds for sea turtles and birds and everything. So it is done in an ecologically responsible manner.
So what type of, I'm interested in this, 2 million mangroves have been planted. What did it take to make that program happen in the first place? I mean, that's considerable.
I think most of the time, science and decision-making don't seem to tie up together. But in this case, we are fortunate that we have a leadership that is very much receptive to reasonable scientific arguments. And together, I think we forged a partnership to make this happen.
And what's next?
Well, the problems, I mean, we are part of the global community. The problems are many. We have just completed a cycle of promotion of biodiversity through the Butina campaign of the 7 Wonders of the World. We did not win, but I think we won because we have put Butina on the map and we have put that biodiversity on the map. And I think in my card, I have biodiversity is life, and I really believe that. You were talking before about aspect of valuation of carbon and environment. I think our main problem is that we tend to do valuation of environment and habitats and everything purely from an economic point of view and in a very short-term manner. What we need to do, we need to include social and community aspects into valuation and take a longer-term view in order to really give the true valuation of habitats and environment. And that's the direction that we want to go.
Short-termism is indeed a big problem. Next.
I'm tempted to talk about the Global Island Partnership, which you mentioned, which was started by the president of Seychelles. And again, I think it echoes what he says. When you have very clear and focused leadership, you can get a lot of issues and a lot of things done. And here I'm talking about island leadership, the islands taking leadership themselves. And GLISPA itself was born after the last WSSD, World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg. Then we had the Islands meeting in Mauritius. And it really is a concept where you bring together the leaders of the small island states together with donors to take action for conservation. And we started off with what we call the Pacific Challenge, the Micronesia Challenge. And there we got the countries of Micronesia to come together and create mine-protected areas of conservation. Then the Caribbean islands also came together and created the Caribbean Challenge. And what I have to share with you today is the Western Indian Ocean, or the Indian Ocean Challenge. Now, the Indian Ocean Challenge is a very specific focus, which is really looking at enhancing resilience to climate change, adaptation to climate change, through protection of and enhancement of marine services. And I think this falls squarely within the ambit of the Blue Carbon platform, Blue Carbon strategy. Because what we're looking at is how we can rehabilitate, how we can restore, how we can improve the relationship between what humans are doing in the environment and helping them to sustain their lives, but also sustain livelihood, but also seeing how these resources can be available in the long term. So we've received financing from the European Union, and we're currently now mobilizing the different countries in the region along the east coast of Africa, the islands in the Western Indian Ocean. There is also interest from west coast of Africa to look at how we can implement a strategy using leadership from the head of state level, involving donors and other agencies in promoting marine conservation, but of course linked with resilience to climate change in those areas.
So getting communities involved.
Of course, very much so. I mean, engaging them, because they are at the interface, and they are the ones who are most to lose. And of course, subtle changes, they feel it the first. So involvement of the community is paramount. But what we've seen is that if we don't have the mobility of the leadership, then whatever work, you can do a lot of work with communities, but then when it comes to changing policies, laws, and also getting the private sector, some of the industrialists, for example, the big companies, on the proper management, then you have issues of equity, issues of access, because as you know, the coastal and marine environment is a very conflict-prone area where you have the different users competing for resources. So governments there can play a big role, and sensitized government and a government who has a very important sustainable development policy and strategy and have the right institutions in place can really, really provide support for communities to be able to survive.
Thank you. Beatrix?
I think from my side, I'm coming from master, we so far do not have an example to show you. However, I think in a moment it's a good opportunity into looking into what kind of tools and mechanisms are available to support this process. I think in a moment we are a little bit on the natural preserve side. I'm coming more from the industrial carbon abatement side. So it's a little bit interesting in a moment how you can combine this, We have the tool of clean development mechanism, which is looking into how you can reduce carbon emissions or put them into storage and monetize this, or make credits available and monetize this so that you have an additional revenue stream to support your project. The other important effect of this also is the reputation you get. It's not just a local event, which you do in the UAE. Suddenly you have a buyer, maybe in Europe, maybe in America, who is interested in this project. So you get a big platform, more or less, which is supporting your project, which is raising the awareness on a global side and also here in local communities. The other aspect, what we try to do here is as well, one vision what Master has is that we want to reduce the carbon footprint of Abu Dhabi. And this, I think there are many, many initiatives in Abu Dhabi to make this happen. But it's easier for people, instead of going to an industrial plant to buy offsets in carbon, it's easier to say, okay, we plant a tree. We want to support this project and plant a tree. Together with the abatement of carbon or storage of carbon we can put into this. So I think it's in a moment a project or an idea which is growing more and more, which is leading to awareness, reputation, and really supporting the great of the idea of blue carbon.
Well, I think this is very important, and as we look at population growth around the world, so much of that is concentrated in cities, and we're seeing cities expand at such a rapid rate that can both be a blessing and a curse. how do we balance urban growth with maintaining coastal ecosystems and the integrity of coastal ecosystems in the face of the urge to landfill, to build? And how is Masdar doing that?
I mean, Master's idea, especially with one of our projects, Master City, we are looking into sustainable solutions, which means also having the right balance between the urban population and nature and natural reserves. But I think very important, I mean, Master is just, one initiative. I think there are many, many more real estate projects going on worldwide, and it's really important for them to understand that there is a value in the mangroves or in other coastal coral reefs or ocean habitats. So I think we have to raise the awareness that this is important, that we need to have this balance.
Well, and not just blue carbon. I'm reminded of the work that I did for my work at CNN around the Katrina, around the oil spill, and the argument that the wetlands along the coast of Louisiana, 1 square mile of wetlands absorbs 1 to 3 feet of storm surge, and that these systems can protect urban environments. Are we seeing people
Maybe
accept
a good
that?
example of that would be the work we did after the devastating tsunami that hit the Indian Ocean. And we started a program called Mangroves for the Future, and it really was not just mangroves, but restoring coastal habitats. And the great thing, there is also a positive blue carbon effect of that. And I think we've now seen a number of examples where we have a funding mechanisms to get local communities getting going on various types of projects. And I think it's a matter of sharing benefits, sharing the opportunity for people to also have a user right or a property right to some of these systems. And so often we neglect the value of nature, but I think it is a matter of really getting the ecosystem values in place and making sure that we have virtuous cycles rather than the quite destructive ones we've seen around the world. Now we've replicated that, so we have another program going in the Pacific right now and a number of the island states. We also have one going in West Africa, and I think this model seems to be working really well. So it's working with nature to create natural barriers, but also to look at what are all the other services that we can provide from here, including the blue carbon ones.
And what do you mean by a virtuous cycle?
Well, I think what we can see is if you restore an ecosystem, you suddenly get more productivity out of it, you get a healthier ecosystem, you actually can have benefits in terms of restocking some of your depleted fish stocks, you have benefits also for tourism. A lot of these areas are, of course, very important for tourism, and no tourist wants to go to a degraded area. No one wants to go to see artificial things if you actually have the beauty of nature that you can enjoy. So I think it's a lot about finding mechanisms for people to actually take pride in their own environment and mechanisms that permit them to also finance these type of projects, and I think that's quite doable these days. I mean, there is a lot of will for people around the world to help, but sometimes the mechanisms aren't in place. I mean, we're very fortunate now that we have a volunteer mechanism when it comes to mangroves that was recently approved, and that's a good way forward. But we need more of those. We need more practical examples, and we need to link the science and the knowledge with the practical application.
And I think that's actually the importance that when we are talking about blue carbon, that's the additional value which we have put now as we realize that it has such an important value for the climate and storing CO2. But we should not forget that, as just been mentioned, that the mangroves, the seagrasses, and the salt marshes have really multiple ecological and ecological values. Coastal protection, fishery, food, and so on. And I think it's extremely encouraging that this whole section, this whole looking at the broad spectrum of values came to the agenda of this important global meeting. And I would just like to mention that we had also a very important discussion yesterday in an outbreak group of several important organizations and experts all around the world, with IUCN, with the World Conservation Monitoring Center, with Conservation International, with Forest Trends, Ocean Foundations, experts from Madagascar, from Senegal, from Indonesia. We all form actually a group and meet partly today again on a regional meeting. There's also in the background that probably the largest funding project from the Global Environmental Facility on blue carbon will go on, and that we will make, starting from here, starting from this regional feasibility study on the Arabian Peninsula, have a real global movement of the major experts in this field to protect these areas. For instance, one thing came out yesterday in the experts, and there's the link also between science and decision makers, as it was talking about planting mangroves. We realized actually that although this is obviously often a very important visibility, is creating awareness about the issue, actually planting mangroves is not always the recipe. First of all, it is often done in areas which those plants will not grow at all. It is on the expense of other habitats, of tidal flats. And it is so important to understand that actually to keep those areas which are existing naturally in bays, in shallow areas, is the important thing. And there tourism is also playing a major role again. Here you have an example in Abu Dhabi where kayak tourism is making advantage of that. It is possible that you can think in a broad scale, why not using or engaging the local or regional airline here to visualize the mangroves and the seagrasses. You have flagship species like the dugongs, which people will be fascinated that they live here, and engage the passengers of that airline to also support probably, for instance, local tour operators which are protecting this and supporting the protection. There you can make a link and can have a broad example like I did touch in when we talked about the Wadden Sea.
Well, you know, you bring up a really important point, and I want to get to that here shortly, but my friend Lalela Laulu, who's, I believe, the moderator of the next panel, always says that tourism is the greatest transfer of wealth between rich and poor in the history of the world, and that there is a tremendous opportunity to tap into that. I think you bring up a great point there. Thabit.
Yeah, I just wanted to interject. For example, we are a very good example of pressures, human pressure on environment. You know, the United Arab Emirates prior to 1968 was maybe 200,000 people. Today, we have maybe together with everybody here, we have about 8 million people. Wow. 90% of them are living close to coastal areas. So it is very important to link science, institutional arrangements, and community participation, meaningful community participation, to try to establish. Because most of the time, I mean, we are behind trying to restore rather than trying to protect. And I think we could move a little bit and become proactive through, say, marine spatial planning and integrated coastal zone management programs that are proactive, that give everybody a little piece of the pie, rather than taking the whole pie. I think that's the right direction to go. And I think that's what we are trying to do here.
You mentioned in the report, I saw a quote that says, you cannot stop development, but you can do it so the development is sustainable. With respect to blue carbon, what are the policies, economic tools, incentives necessary to make development sustainable here in the Arabian Peninsula and around the world?
I think it starts with strategic environmental planning and assessment, and then moving that to more operational environmental impact assessment and everything. But to do that, you need to do it with the community involved. And so the aspect of social learning and learning what social capital is very important in the process.
Now, one of the things that, one of the trends, I think, in this conversation has been communities. In my experience, communities are oftentimes overlooked, the grassroots, in terms of not only being part of the solution with respect to implementing that solution, but also having, sometimes from an indigenous perspective, solutions in place culturally, historically, that we can tap into, that we maybe try and over-engineer the problem. Rolf, you mentioned communities a little bit earlier. I'd like to dig into this a little bit more, because it's a personal passion of mine that, that we, I think, overlook the again, as I said, the wisdom of communities and,
Yes,
and,
well,
and getting them this buy-in.
Yeah. The oxymoron of me being the president of a university is actually something that I've learned throughout my career and passion with the environment, is you actually learn a lot more by talking and interacting with communities. And many of the solutions that even we are using in Seychelles today were used by the communities 50 years ago. And with the arrival of concrete, with the arrival of other engineering feats, we've replaced that with those new things. And those new things actually, like seawalls, as defense systems, are really kind of creating more destruction for, as you probably all know, the wonderful beaches of the Seychelles. So we've gone back to looking at those more community knowledge and how they protected the land from the oceans using very traditional methods, protecting the mangroves, replanting the coastal vegetation. So the value of engaging the community can never be undermined or underestimated. I mean, it's not only the knowledge that they have, but also the inbuilt resilience, because when the kids grow up within the community itself, they are taught. They learn from peers and colleagues. The fishermen, for example, will tell you a lot about the changes that's happening, but also how they're adapting to those changes. So there's a lot of stuff happening at the community, and we cannot really ignore them. They have to also be empowered, because building their capacity as well is important, because there's some new knowledge as well coming in, which we need to exchange with them or to bounce off them. So really this fluid exchange between communities and the scientific community and the research community, I mean, monitoring as well. Sylvia this morning mentioned the big gap in monitoring and research and mapping and understanding the linkage in the environment. And the community is, I think, a very, very important component of that whole process.
Well, we've got about a few minutes left. I'd like to go to Carl and then end with you,
Okay.
Sylvia. You got the first word. I'd like you to get the last as well.
All right, great.
Well,
Carl?
we haven't talked much about the coral reefs, but I think the health of the reefs is another natural defense system, and people tend to underestimate the linkage between the different coastal ecosystems and their ability to actually protect and create sort of a functionality. And there I think there's a lot more science, and there's a lot more understanding of where we are. We have new emerging threats like ocean acidification, which we need to deal with. And I think this thing of building resilience and managing for resilience is something that is the heart of the solutions that we're looking at. And for those of you who are not so familiar, the resilience concept, I think, is helping nature on its way to really cope with all kinds of changes that are happening, be they man-made or natural variations, and then finding what makes them actually bounce back quicker to recover. And we've seen so much loss that, we're in a game of trying to prevent these things and making systems be healthy. But you can also talk about social resilience, and I think that's another valuable example where we can work with communities to rebuild themselves and recover and work more in harmony with nature.
Well, I think you bring up a great point, Carl, and I do a lot of work with young people, and I always try and think of simple ways for me to understand these concepts. When you talk about resilience, in the work that I do, we look at communities in areas where there's already existing degradation of coastal marine habitats, be it from some sort of direct anthropogenic, human-caused impact, deforestation, runoff, pollution, whatever it may be, and that if those ecosystems are already degraded, the larger global impacts like ocean acidification and climate change, rising ocean temperatures, are all the worse. It's like a human being. If you have tuberculosis, you might be able to survive that. But if you have tuberculosis and then you get hit with cancer and you get hit with meningitis, it's all over. And so it means it's even more important now to allow these ecosystems and to provide them an opportunity to be as healthy as possible and to stop the local anthropogenic impacts on them, to allow them to be resilient, to allow them to then have a prayer to survive these larger global issues. I think that's a very, very interesting comment. And because we're out of time, I do wanted to give Sylvia an opportunity to wrap it up for us all.
Well, I think we should certainly look in the mirror and realize we are not the only species on this planet. We're not the only organism that has communities. Fish have social structure, whales have social structure, mangrove forests have social structures, if you will, and we're dependent on them. It is all about us, but it is about taking care of the natural systems that keep us alive if we are to really survive. it's a whole lot more difficult to restore a damaged system than protecting what already works. And we are so fortunate that we are on a planet right now, while there still is time. Not a lot, given the rate of depletion and degradation. But there is time. We still have tunas. We still have mangroves. We still have coral reefs. There's still a few monk seals in the Caribbean. We lost them, I mean, in the Mediterranean and Hawaii. We lost them in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. They're gone. When a species disappears, there's no more hope. But presently, there's a lot of hope for what remains. And the key is what's happening at this conference. It's knowing. It's identifying problems. You can't solve a problem until you know you've got one. And I think this whole conference is really focusing on, we've got some problems. There are data gaps. There's a knowledge gap that we need to fill. And the ocean is a big part of that. If we really appreciate not just the coastal areas, as important as they are, but the whole ocean. You don't know that your heart matters until, like about now. It took all preceding history to realize how our human body functions and what we have to do to take care of it. Well, the ocean is the blue heart of the planet, and we're finally beginning to realize that it truly matters. If we are to survive, we have to take care of it, even if we don't see it. Even if we don't get down to the deepest part of the ocean, we know that it matters, and we know we can destroy it. But on our watch, we have the power to keep the options open. Presently, a tiny fraction of 1% of the ocean is safe for fish and other ocean wildlife. A little more than 1% is actually embraced for areas that are, quotes, managed, really managed in a way that is intending to protect them and have some form of protection as a marine sanctuary or reserve or other designation, like the Great Barrier Reef. 33% of the Great Barrier Reef is protected for the wildlife. So it's on our watch that we'll decide. Will there or will there not be a healthy future for humans and all the rest of life on Earth? Now's the time. As never before, maybe as never again.
Well, I know that I will come out of this with a renewed sense of urgency. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you to all of our panelists for your insight and your hard work, and we will continue to fight for a better future. Thank you.